Great. Thank you, Alex. And thanks for everybody coming. This is our first webinar of the year, and we've had incredible feedback from the many engagements and webinars we did in 2019. And so we're excited to be able to offer this ongoing webinar series as a resource to you who are looking to really think differently in your organizations or on your teams as a means to create different outcomes. And so Alex said a little bit about In Rhythm. You know, we've been around for a good 10 years and as a consulting organization. In the last few years, we started transitioning to really supporting organizations with a new designed approach. And we're excited to support you in this process. So with no further ado, the thing that we're really most excited about in terms of what this looks like from our perspective as a organization or as a change agent is just this idea of unleashing potential that exists within your teams. And we recognize that that's a challenge. And so today on the webinar, we're gonna cover 4 key areas. One is understanding that challenge. We're gonna talk about our approach, which we see as the living systems approach, and why, as an alternative to current approaches. And then we're gonna talk about that from a principle-based perspective. And then we're also gonna talk about how that lands in frameworks that you can use to begin to do something different in your organization. So one of the things I wanted to start with was this quote from Einstein. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And you know, I know that some of you have probably heard this quote before, and it may have been applied in a lot of different contexts, but for us today, we actually hold a belief that every individual is unique and brings a incredible, unique genius to the roles that they play. Unfortunately, the design of our organizations currently usually isn't in a position to put that genius to work. And so we are actually really engaged in helping organizations and individuals to rethink, how do you put that genius to work? Because I think the way Einstein put it, if you take somebody who really is a fish and you put them in a position where what they're doing day in and day out is climbing a tree, you're not going to be able to create the conditions for that individual to thrive or for the organization to benefit from their unique contribution. So we're really going to go into that. And the way that we approach this is really looking through this lens of, so what is the dominant metaphor for how we design our organizations? And I want you to just think about it for a moment. Let me give you a couple of minutes, or actually just a couple of seconds to think about it in terms of what is that dominant metaphor? I'm sure some of you are thinking about, you know, some of the hierarchical things that show up in organizations. Top down may be seen as a metaphor, but really what we see has been dominant over the last century and even longer, we can go into a longer conversation around that, is this idea of a machine. And there are so much, there's so much information out there that begins to build off of this, your business as a machine. Even a state in the United States, for those of you here in the United States, this slide here shows Georgia as an economic engine. And so in that kind of metaphor, we're beginning to see that, you know, different teams on an organization would be considered cogs, and we have then this idea of levers. But you know what's interesting is we've not really held back where we applied that metaphor. We've even applied it in how we talk about people and organizations. So we have this language, right? And I catch myself even using it coming out of the tech industry, that's working with a well-oiled machine, or I don't have bandwidth for that. And so we've got some interesting language that we've adopted that really is intimately tied to this idea or this symbolism of us, our organizations, as machines and levers and parts, and even talking about we need fuel to get us from there to there, or we got to move the needle on that, meaning that we've got to move quickly. And all of that is this metaphor of machine. And we've actually seen it, even this is a really old picture of just the early ages of seeing the body as a machine. And with the body as a machine, what and how much that really impacts, arms as levers and the heart as a pump. But there becomes a real challenge with us in terms of what if we begin to operate with the language that we're actually using. And so I asked the question, what are the unintended consequences of organizing like a machine? And I think all of us began to understand that we've got challenges in organizations, but sometimes I don't think we equate the challenges to the right root causes. And so what does it look like in terms of the consequence? And we actually see this as related, is we see full-on disengagement. Gallup has done some incredible research, and it's actually being embraced by multiple research organizations across the world, where we see people completely disengaged at work. To realize that in the engaged category, that only 13% of the people are truly engaged in their role, in their work, and that most people are disengaged or actively disengaged, it causes us to say, so what about this is creating those conditions? We also recognize that not only do we have disengagement, but we begin to do a lot of research on what happens when people are engaged. And what's interesting is we begin to see that, and most of the research says, 3 times the productivity from someone engaged in their role within the workplace versus someone that's not. So when we talk about employee potential and team members being able to be engaged, we see it intimately tied to how it's designed and what engagement looks like in the roles that everyone's a part of. So when we recognize that disengagement is really costing organizations and the individuals their own well-being, we also realize when someone is engaged, their well-being is positive, it's healthy, and the organization benefits greatly from that. But we see all of this as a design issue. And we really take a design approach, and we really encourage team leaders and organizations to take that approach as well, even if they don't engage us. What can we do differently to design for different outcomes? But when we identify the root problems, we began to recognize that machine paradigm that we talk about, that machine metaphor, is rooted in some real ideas of how we manage problems. And so just briefly, we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but there are 3 types of problems, or we may even call them opportunities. One would be, we were going to a simple problem. If we were going to, say, bake a cake, or we're going to build a table, right? That would be a simple problem. There's ingredients, there's a list, there's recipes, there's a series of known steps. We're pretty clear on what some of the assumptions are, and we can manage them, and we can get the same results over and over and over again. Some people are good at being able to do that extremely well, and some people aren't at following those instructions. But I think about someone who's trying to build a table from IKEA, or someone that's simply trying to bake a pie, right? But both of those things are things that we can repeat. And then you've got complicated problems, which are actually a little more, there's more details to them. There's more There's some inputs, just like there was on the simple problem, but there are some blueprints. People have been down that path before. And so if I'm going to design a car, there are some blueprints to follow in reference to that. There's a series of known steps. Again, there's some assumptions, but the effects are manageable. And again, we get a repeated result. We can do that. Ford found that out when he did the assembly line in the early 1900s, right? He could repeat this over and over again. But when we move to complex problems, it's not simple and it's not complicated. It actually is very complex. We've got interdependent inputs. Every situation is different. The context is different. Steps are not just unknown, they're not reliable at times. What worked in one situation doesn't work in another. The assumptions change because the context is different. And even consequences. We have unintended consequences based upon how we are applying that. And the thing that's really important to know about complex situations is outcomes are unpredictable. So I'm going to spend a little time on those two, the last two, complicated and complex. And what's interesting is when you think about a machine, it's actually in the complicated category. We can actually got inputs, there's a series of steps, and we have predictable outputs. And we love that context because we can actually see and predict the outcomes that we want. And so when we think about what that looks like, I mean, it really is about how good we are at making things. We're really good at making things. And we can show the success from technology, from all the different manufacturing that we've done, to be able to show the progress as a society over our ability to make things, because we can repeat it and it can get stronger and better. And then on the complex things, because of those interdependencies and those nonlinear relationships, it's quickly unpredictable. So when we're trying to manage environments, so it could be the natural environment or the social environment, or we're talking about policy, and we're getting into complex situations like solving for racism or poverty. It isn't about following a set of steps or instructions. And because of that, we have to have a different design process. And that's really what this is. This lands it in, when we talk about the machine paradigm, that's all about these cogs and parts, works great when we're making things. But when we're managing complexity, which is a living system, which is nature and people, it requires a different management process. So the consequence of treating people as parts of a machine is this degradation of organizations. You know, Gallup goes far as to say that it's costing organizations in the US alone anywhere between $500 million to $750 million a year. And can you imagine what that's doing to people? Well, I'll tell you what it's doing to people. People are unwell globally, and this is not just a US issue. Insecurity because of how things are designed, feeling less healthy because of the pressures in the workplace, and then just being stressed and unhappy and unsafe. This design does not serve humanity. So when we talk about, some people will use language like human potential, people desire a different design and need a different design for us to be able to engage that genius. Because the last thing we want is people to feel like this. Because if our machines, if our organizations are machines, our teams are cogs and levers, then that tells us that people are parts. And we want to move away from that commoditization and move to something that recognizes the value, the unique value and contribution that people bring into the workplace, into their communities. And so we want to use life as a metaphor. And so just imagine, in contrast to this, we would like it to be seen as this, which is when you think of nature and you think of the creating conditions and healthy soils and waters and the ability for life to thrive, that's how we see a organization and see communities. And so what we want to do is, what does it look like to create the conditions for energy to exist in an organization for people to thrive? Because we actually believe there's a connection between people thriving and the organization's long-term viability. And that viability being able to create productivity outcomes, but not at the expense of the health of that beautiful, complex system. So we've used some really solid research that's come from the school, the Santiago School is what we call it. And that Santiago School has what we call it's one of the first real research that was done with a systems view of life. And that systems view of life really begins to see with life operates very differently than the way that we see machines or that industrial design looking like. And there's a couple of incredible things they did. They mapped a cell, bacteria, and then they began to see what made it thrive, what made the energy flow within that cell. And one of the key things it found out as a defining aspect of life was this idea of self-maintenance and self-regeneration. And they actually coined this idea of autopoiesis, which is self-poetry, self-making. And that's actually what we think an organization is. It's a collection of individuals that come together with unique geniuses like a cell wall, and that creates an identity, and that identity has the ability for it to create a poetry, a regenerative outcome, a regeneration of potential that you do not see in complicated contexts like building cars or machines. So we see life as an organized system capable of maintaining itself within a boundary of its own making. And that is a really powerful statement, because that organized system is complex and it moves and it changes and it needs to adapt and it needs to be flexible to recognizing the genius of people who are there versus seeing everybody in roles or in parts that really doesn't have and isn't designed to bring that genius out. So one of the things that we recognized when they did that research, or what they recognized, was that life wasn't in any one place within that cell wall. It was dependent upon all of the interconnected relationships, that life itself was a holistic or emergent property of the cell. And as I said before, even those individual wholes were actually self-poetic as well, kind of auto-poetic themselves. And so it just gives even more meaning that an individual comes in with a uniqueness and a genuine ability to contribute as a part of a larger context of a team. And knowing that relationship exists, then how do we design with the organization's outcomes in mind, but not at the expense of the health of those individuals? And that's what we're most excited about continuing to do in organizations around the world, and actually in all kinds of different projects and movements. Now, what was interesting is a couple of really interesting things came out of that. They also stated, so what end then is death? And so death was the lack of its ability to be self-regenerative or to self-maintain. And it was the lack of interconnected relationships. So what's interesting is so to give you a real example, just think about the human body. On the left side, the heart, the brain, the stomach, the lungs, the nerves, the skeleton, all working in concert with one another is life. Now, on the other side, that is death. When the heart is not working with the brain and the lungs and all those things are not working, life can't exist in the human body. Now, what's interesting when you think about this, we're going to look about an organization. Now, think about the organization. You got HR and sales and customer service and marketing and research and IT and management and all these things. And when they're working in real concert with one another, there really is life. I think there's full-on engagement in an organization. But when you see those disconnected, it really is truly death. Now, what's interesting is when you go back to this analogy of the body, we know how to make the heart work outside of the body. But what does it need? It needs external inputs to make it stay alive outside of that functioning whole. And interestingly, we can do that with the brain, and we can do that with the lungs. We've found ways to make those things work separately from one another. But it requires an enormous amount of energy for that to be the case. But then when it works within the body, it doesn't need that extra energy to do that. And I think in organizations, we use an enormous amount of external inputs as a means to keep things looking like they're functioning in a healthy way. But in reality, they're just dying. And so what do we do to design it differently? And we've used all kinds of things to, and I'm going to use this word on purpose, to create the facade that it's healthy and that it is working. But when you take some of those inputs out, let's just think about bonuses or things that we've used as a way to money, as a way to incentivize people to be engaged in the workplace, when all the research tells us that's not their number one motivator. That's not why they're there. It tells us we need a different design. And so when we recognize on a team, the same thing has happened. When a team is interconnected and there's a strong relationship, it brings a whole different level of energy than when there is not. So then you can think about this list. This was, created over 10 years ago. But just the idea, so what are the potential shifts then if we are talking about organizations to look different? And so you can see this here. Give you guys a couple of minutes to read what the contrast is in this shift from a mechanistic viewpoint and metaphor and design to one that is a life-designed metaphor and approach. So one that is stable versus dynamic, or resists change versus leverages diversity, linear versus networked, one that's short-term versus long-term. I mean, we really begin to see that it is different. It feels different in our guts. It creates energy versus energy is dissipated or drained out of those kinds of designs. But what I want you to do now is I want you to spend just a minute, and I want you to see, in light of this list, what are 3 organizational practices that you think are limiting potential in the workplace? Just things that we're doing currently that we know are getting in the way of releasing the potential that exists in the people that are in our organizations. And I'm going to pause and let you guys think of a couple of things, and then maybe you throw a couple of those into the chat.
Hey, Trey, do you think you could flip back to the list?
There we go.
Thank you. Just letting you know, Trey, there was a little background noise or feedback at times, so maybe try and stay the same distance from the camera. I can't figure out what it might have been, but yeah.
Very good.
Thank you.
All right. Are there any examples of that you think would show up in organizations in light of that would need to shift?
We've got some comments coming in. Somebody says hierarchies, lack of transparency, command and control.
Awesome. Great. Yes, substantial changes in what how the organization is designed. So in terms of the typical pyramid design, actually it could be a flatter. It could have all kinds of different ways that the organization looks, maybe even holes within holes as a part of that design. Great.
One more, we've got a short-term is a challenge on funding models for nonprofit firms.
Great. So part of the challenge with, any of this design is, what does it look like for us to make sure that our design isn't just about creating short-term outcomes, that the design changes to be able to still create shorter outcomes, but not at the expense of long-term health. And me having spent years in the nonprofit space, I know what it's like to let funders kind of tail wag the dog, right? Where all of a sudden we're changing who we are because we're chasing the dollar. So I think those are great examples. Thank you.
We've got one more from Facebook. Somebody says avoidance of conflict, denial and rigidity to consistent changes.
Awesome. So which we'll actually talk about. So that idea that our organizations aren't designed to evolve, they're actually currently designed to be static. And so it makes it very difficult because we're actually continuing to butt up against the design of the organization as a means to bring life into it. And so what does it look like for us to be able to design, to be able to have different thoughts and communication and diversity so that we can have conversations in an organization that may have different opinions and different views without that being threatening. And I think in a living system, we can do that. In a mechanical system, it actually creates tension. And actually that tension reduces its ability to be productive. And that's why everybody has to walk in a certain way in that machine paradigm. So I'm going to move on to our next slide. So for us, when we think about this machine paradigm, we recognize that it engineers a process that we are very familiar with called best practices. And I actually am not an advocate of best practices. I think, especially when we're talking about complex systems, a set of instructions in building a table, if you want to call that a best practice, I'll adopt that all day long. But when we are talking about what it looks like for us to manage a context of creative, innovative people who bring a genius, the way it works with a group of people, even in the same industry, in the same kind of company, is different than it is for another organization. And it can't be based on best practices, because best practices really reinforces this idea of prescriptive structures. It all has to look the same. And so we're talking about, hey, yeah, what's that silver bullet solution? As though if we just do it right, it will work over and over and over again. And what we think, when you apply that approach, that machine design approach, that mechanistic approach to a living system, to a complex system, we believe it degenerates the health of the system, which means it's not surprising to us that people, the majority of people, would be disengaged in organizations today, because it's not designed to be able to harness that energy and create emergent outcomes. It's designed to take what they need most and put it to work, and then the rest can be set aside, which we all know we want to find ways to bring our whole self into the workplace. Now, what's interesting is when we think about a living systems design, we think it's about informing principles that we can design around, not best practices. So when we think about that, it opens up an enormous amount of freedom, and it facilitates this idea of flexible frameworks, which we believe regenerates the health of the system. And when you think about nature and you think about things that can thrive, it really is based about looking into that and seeing the principles that are allowing things to be mutualistic and holistic versus siloed, and what's best for me doesn't necessarily have to be best for you. One we think requires an enormous amount of energy, And we can see that every mechanistic system needs energy for it to stay alive, right? And when I say stay alive, to keep running versus the life that we see in the other system. And we actually think that the living system actually, because of its design, actually energy gets created and maintains itself because it's both self-maintaining and regenerating. And we also realize that for us to make that shift or make that move to the living system requires shifts in perspectives and in operations. So let's just talk about what this means. When we talk about this principle-based design, here are the 6 principles that we encourage people to think about when they're designing with a living system in mind. And those living principles, we think, show up. So it's been informed out of nature, out of those living systems. And that is, there are no silos. Everything is interrelated and dependent. So for us to believe that if we make a decision in finance, that's not going to impact sales, is us living in a reality that's not true. Yet decisions are made like that all the time, aren't they? The next one's mutualism. To understand that we need to design to create the conditions for life, there needs to be mutualism with those that are living together. So how do you do that? What does it look like to design for the individual members of the team to thrive? Not to be able to just create increased productivity and efficiency, but that they thrive so that what's emergent out of that is even greater than what you designed it for. And we can see that in all kinds of different living examples. And that we recognize uniqueness needs to show up as a part of this design, and I've talked about it through the first part of this presentation. And as it was mentioned by one of you who attended, it needs to be designed with this evolutionary perspective because it needs to maintain a dynamic balance with the ever-changing things around, from markets to nature to people changing to communities changing. So all of that needs to be a part of this process. And we also recognize the opportunity for it to be nodal, decentralized, and distributed. We need to recognize that decision-making can't be just in the hands of the few. Power can't be just in the hands of the few. It needs to be locally managed on a local team or in a local geography and distributed in a way that allows for decisions to have real meaning versus somebody in an office that did not know about the context here, made that decision that's been pushed through the organization. And we also see in a living system that the principle that comes out of that is that it's designed to be developmental. There is room for growth and health, and that you manage that as a part of the design process. Now, what's interesting for us today, because we're talking about team members and employees, is that I want to call out uniqueness, or this idea of what you bring as that is original to you, and the possibility of individual genius that shows up. And I say possibility because a lot of our individual geniuses don't show up in our roles. And that's because most of that time it's been capped because we have to be who somebody else said we needed to be. And so one of the things that that I want to show is this idea that when we think about people thriving, we think about people thriving within these 3 perspectives, and that is genius, well-being, and role. And we've got a framework that we use with organizations and people to help them work through that. And this framework design is not telling people what that should be in an organization, but asking deep, meaningful questions. And so when we talk about genius or the uniqueness that someone brings into an organization, we want you to connect with your why. And what is it that allows you as an individual to thrive? And we know if we can tap that and understand the passions that you bring, like you may like working with nature and working with animals or working with individuals and children, and then it's landing in a meaningful place, meaningful work. We believe when genius is designed that way, it really creates the conditions for people to thrive, because people are connected to their why. They're engaged in their passions, which we see as unlimited energy, and it's in a place that's meaningful. Now, what's interesting when we think about that, I'm going to jump because we've talked about well-being in terms of health, but we also recognize that what we believe are constructs, how we treat our bodies, you know, the energy we get from the food we eat, to how we put our body in a place of being able to have more energy, and the people we connect with, I think, make up our well-being. And then when we think about role or work, we actually say that the workplace should be designed with your genius in mind, that the conditions should be healthy for that genius to show up, and that there should be a healthy exchange or contribution from all those involved. And we take this framework and we help people, and we want you as a part of a team to begin to recognize that this kind of design, it actually helps the energy and it engages people versus disengaged. Because now you're asking the things that are meaningful versus just what roles they play in that of job descriptions that were designed. Now, I don't know if you know this, but you know that most of our job descriptions today were designed in the 50s. And I don't think most people realize that, but you can take a job description that was designed for, say, an administrative assistant or a product manager, and it is almost identical from what's changed from what was designed 60 years ago or 70 years ago from what is designed today. And that is a travesty, because what we believe is people bring an enormous amount of creativity and energy and genius that needs to be designed into what we believe will allow that organization to thrive and tap that potential. So when we think about this, we also recognize that those flexible frameworks are all a part of something bigger. So we've got what we call the regenerative framework, and that framework allows us to take the process I just described that we see as organizational health and be able to design with that energy in mind. And so we recognize that when we use these frameworks, we begin to see it from a very different perspective, that it is people-centered because it's a living system of people. And what's interesting is when you think about the mechanistic design, its real motivation and how it stays alive is with fuel, and it maximizes productivity and efficiency, right? I mean, you want a machine to be as efficient as possible. You want it to produce as much as it possibly can. And you want to know what the known inputs are to be able to make that reliable, scalable, and be able to repeat it, right? Over and over and over again. And you measure its effectiveness based on its efficiency of fuel use and its ability to be productive, right? Now, when you think about a living system, that whole conversation doesn't exist. You think about our body begins to be able to do more because it's healthy. So you measure a living system off of its health, not its ability to have inputs, its ability to manage efficiency and productivity. Now, what you believe, or what I believe and Rhythm believes, is that as a result of doing that, you actually do create the conditions for productivity and efficiency to show up, but it shows up in ways far greater than what you could have designed it to be. Because we believe when you bring all those components together, 1 + 1 truly equals 3, and isn't just an extension of its design. It is exponential. It is emergent, and it is more beautiful. So when you think about that, now I want you to think of all those things that we've just talked about, and I want you to ask yourself, what is one practice that you could immediately change to support team members to realize their full potential? Let's just kind of sit on that for a second, and maybe you can write some thoughts down privately. I'm going to pause. Great. So I just want you to hold those for a second, and I'm going to read this to you. So what we have is a working definition that we use when we engage in these conversations, which is what we call the regenerative organization. So we see it as a living, evolving, and naturally functioning organization environment where abundance and resilience are recurring outcomes of its underlying health. And I think if we can design with that in mind, we truly do get different outcomes. So thank you. And I just want to open it up to questions and see if anybody wants to share some thoughts or reflections before we close off the talk today. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Trey. Yeah, so, anyone, if tuning in from Zoom or from Facebook, please feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat or in the comments. For those here on Zoom, you're also welcome to unmute yourself if you're comfortable. So we'll give you a sec. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask them. Or comments or thoughts are welcome too.
I'll chime in. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I sent a picture to my friend who is at work, and she had called me earlier in the day just telling me she was having a terrible time at work. And I sent her a picture of the thriving employees and, trying to thrive with genius. And she's just, a lot of people are in a situation where their work is not, it's not an environment where it's definitely mechanistic and you're trying to get results, but it doesn't seem like it's a thriving, natural, living environment. It's life sucking, not life giving. And so I was sending her that picture and she was like, oh, wow. And to have an environment where you're actually thriving is amazing. You're looking for somewhere where you can contribute, and it does take less energy because you're just building on it, and that's fun. So
that's awesome. Thanks, Jen. Actually, that brought up a question for me, and maybe this will help bubble up some questions. I have so many friends who I've met so many people who see their jobs more as just simply jobs, not something that they're looking for, to find passion or purpose in. Trey, do you have any thoughts on that and how you see kind of folks who might not identify with really finding their passion and purpose at work?
Yeah, actually, I encourage them to rethink that, because to me, it's not about, it's just that if you're going to spend, I remember saying this to myself almost 20 years ago now, if I'm going to spend 8 to 10 hours a day with people and a place that I work, for it not to be purposeful or meaningful, other than what I get out of it in terms of financial benefit, seems to be like an incredible waste of time and resources and just my life. I want it to be more meaningful. And so I think that may be more a design of the organization and just expectations that have just been lowered because of that. And it could be just you haven't found the right place, and maybe there is a place where you can wed together your purpose, your passion, and the place you work. And I actually believe you can.
Awesome, thanks. I'm sure others will appreciate those thoughts as well. So anybody else, any questions or thoughts or comments? Oops, sorry. Well, all right.
All
Trey?
right, guys, thank you. And I'll let Alex close us out. So.
Yeah, so just one thing we wanted to share with you all. If this was interesting to you and if you want to learn more, we're offering an online course. It starts next Thursday on thriving teams. So we'll dive into everything from, okay, well, what does it actually look like to begin to design your team or in a way that unleashes potential, like we talked about today. So looking at everything from roles and responsibilities to how do you design with genius to functional things like recruiting and compensation and onboarding, and how do you do that in a way that's life-giving rather than energy draining, and how to design structures that support that. So if you're interested, I've got the link there, and we'll be sharing this PowerPoint afterwards so that you can have access to that. Would love for you to join us. And then lastly, if you go to the next slide, Trey, we just wanted to share our contact information. So most of you should have my email who signed up for this this webinar, but if you want to reach Trey, his email's there, and then also encourage you to connect with us on social media. Yeah, and once again, just thanks all for your time. Super grateful and hope to connect with you in the future. And thank you again, Trey. This was awesome. Okay, bye everyone.
Thank you, everyone.